We connect.
I know. Sorry, it's kind of been one of those crazy back and
I hear
forths.
you.
Cool. So this is really just a chat between you and I. And well, let's kick off. I mean, like you've done these before, right? So if you make a mistake or you have any challenges or anything, just say the word sausages. I know it sounds a bit weird, but
That's the safe
that's
word.
the safe word that stops
Okay.
us because we can pick it up on the script and stop. So
Okay.
sausages. Now we're going to start.
Okay. I'll try not to because I know that's kind of a pain on the back end. So we'll do our best.
Thank you.
No
That's fine.
sausages this morning.
Well, hopefully not exactly. So cool. Anyway, so there we go. So sausages. Hello and welcome back to the IVF Daddies podcast. Today we have the amazing Maya, who not only is here to talk to us today, but like me, she found her passion on the back of doing her journey. But I wrote a book. She made a film. So not only did she make a film, she produced the film, she wrote it all, she did it all. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. So Maya, tell us a little bit more about that before we kick off with everything.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, I think sometimes people who go through a fertility journey really have a life-changing experience that changes the trajectory of their career, their conceptualization of family, and all kinds of things, and feel compelled to create something. And that's, I think, why we made a film. So yeah, just to introduce myself, I'm a psychotherapist in the field of reproductive medicine, and I was a fertility patient from like 2010 to about 2015. So it was one of those unexpected, my life is falling into the abyss of fertility treatments, while simultaneously, my husband is in film and television. And so simultaneously, we ended up documenting that journey. So I'm a social worker by training. He's in film and TV. And our intention was, oh, I have diminished ovarian reserve. I'm young. People aren't talking about this. And remember, this is like, 2010. This is pre Instagram and and like all, not Facebook, but TikTok and all these other things, so there weren't a lot of stories of fertility and IVF and alternative family building that resonated.
Right.
There were like empty cradles in the rain and whatever, but that wasn't, we had a sense of humor about it, but we were also like, what is going on here? So we ended up documenting. We thought we'd have like a 3 to 5 minute little short on IVF and how different babies are made in different ways, and sometimes you have a special doctor, and that turned into a very extensive 4+ year journey of IVF, IUIs. My sister donated eggs to us at one point in our process, and then ultimately nothing was working. And ultimately we landed on embryo donation. If you would have told us at the beginning of this process in my early 30s that I was going to have a child through embryo donation, I would have, and I did. I was like, I just wouldn't have even known what that is. So embryo donation is when an individual or couple has remaining embryos from their journey and they elect to donate them to somebody else. So we kind of landed there as the next best option for us, and filmed the whole thing. I spoiled the end of the film, but at least
You have. I mean, it's spoiler alert, embryo donation. And you watch it for an hour and a half. I mean, it's an hour and a half long. You can watch it, and then at the end, you're like, oh, it's like the Titanic. We know it's right. I'm like, correct.
But also, I think it's helpful to know that there's a happy ending. And we didn't know if we'd have a happy ending. And that's why we started following other people who also had journeys.
Right.
And, and I didn't know anything. I didn't know about surrogacy much. I didn't know about egg donation. I didn't know what it took when there are 2 men or 2 women who are, wanting to have a child. And I didn't know what it was like for a single person, and so we started interviewing people on different ways that families come together. And it was really incredible. So the film is called One More Shot. I think I didn't mention that.
We're not talking about shots of vodka, right? We're talking about shots
it depends on what part of the journey we're talking about. There are multiple shots happening throughout the course of all of it. But But it sort of segues nicely into my work now with Empower with Moxie, which is my embryo donation organization, because the film, so we got very lucky with distribution. We made this film with no real intention of making a film. We put it together. We felt really strongly that our story was a version of so many other people's stories. I mean, millions of people, as you know, go through this. And at that time, really not a lot were talking about it. So we were like, we'll get this out in some way, shape, or form. So we did that, and then we it was on Netflix for 2 years, and that was huge distribution for us, obviously. And what ended up happening, a lot of things, but primarily we started getting emails from people all around the world. So people, obviously, right, and sharing their own stories and things like that, but also offering us their embryos,
Oh, wow.
which I was floored. My husband and I were like, what's going on here? People, because it was in all English speaking countries. So we were getting people in the UK, people in Canada, people across the US saying, here's a photo of me and my family and my children. And I have 4 embryos, and my husband were like, oh my gosh, this is an option. We went through an anonymous, and I put that in quotes for a variety of reasons, but a clinic program that we just didn't know anything. And then I started thinking, this is incredible. People they have embryos after their journeys, as you do. And I did listen to your sort of recent podcast, and I'd love to dig into that with you a little
Yeah.
bit, your experience, but people have embryos, they connected to our story, and they wanted to help us. And they were willing to redefine family in a certain way with us.
Well, I think that's one of the things that if the podcast that I did, right? So I choked up a little bit when I was talking about that, because for me it still is actually a very emotive topic, and I want to delve into that at a later time. But how do you, like, you're there, you've done this film, people are starting to come to you. It's almost like you've discovered your passion of going, there's this out here, like we've educated people, we now know what the options are. What can we do to now advocate for others, right? So you then found that. So that's, I'm guessing, how you started doing the company you now run,
Yeah.
and how that all came about. But so, what type of families are donating embryos to you, and why are they donating embryos?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. It was really eye-opening to have that experience personally on the back end, and we didn't end up. We have one child. We that was the end of our journey, but it was this really incredible thing, and I started really exploring. My career shifted. I was a therapist working with kids and families, and then I shifted. I took courses through ASRM. I really got to understand donor conception, third-party consultations. How do you make meaning of sharing genetics in this way? And I learned a lot about the donor conceived person's needs and perspectives. And I saw how clinics were primarily doing embryo donation, because it is complicated. And most clinics at that time, and it continues to be like this, were doing and are doing embryo donation in a very anonymous way. So
So
embryo,
what does that mean? Because I'm like, you mentioned that you did yours through a clinic, but now you've got people who are reaching out to you directly to
right,
say, hey, we have these, do you want them?
right,
How does the
exactly.
clinic
Yeah.
work?
So I was researching and looking into how does embryo donation work, and there are clinics that basically, when somebody's done with their IVF cycle and they have remaining embryos, research shows that people store embryos for about 5 years once they feel their family is complete, and then there's this moment of, I got to make a
Now what?
decision.
Now
Right.
what do I do?
Sometimes I think of it's like shit or get off the pot, right? So it's like, okay, what do I do at this point? And so people have to make decisions around that. And so a lot of clinics will offer an internal, sometimes a small internal embryo donation program where patients can essentially give or relinquish their custody of their embryos, the legal custody of their embryos, to the clinic. And then the clinic can then decide which recipients receive those embryos. So there's not a connection between embryo donors and recipients. There's not a lot of information shared. And it's a little bit simple, I guess, in some ways, in terms of there's no legal contract between people. It just, the clinic facilitates that. So,
It seems a bit impersonal, I think, is a word. It's almost like you've got a patient who has surplus embryos or embryos they're not going to use or embryos they're not going to destroy, that they're sitting there like I do. Like I've got two that
Hmm.
I know that for me, the way that I look at it, they're not life. They won't ever become life. But and yet I can't bring myself to do anything with them. I guess there must be lots of people in my
Exactly.
shoes, right? And this is actually one of the things I want to touch on when I'm talking to you. And then you've got patients that are trying to do IVF or can't afford IVF or doing stuff, and the clinic just matches them. That seems pretty impersonal.
I agree. Yeah, and think about it from your perspective. If the clinic, people trust their clinics. These clinics have helped, their doctors helped people have families.
Yeah.
It's amazing, right? And so a lot of times, I mean, I was with my doctor for the better part of 5 years. I see him now at ASR. I mean, he's a place in my heart. Like I loved this man. So it's this experience that people have, and then a lot of people want to give back to others. They've had a real struggle. It took a lot. Maybe there's a lot of time, effort, money to create these embryos. Sometimes there are spiritual or religious beliefs as to the why. But the impersonal part is exactly why we created Empower with Moxie, because we couldn't fathom this idea. Like, could you imagine that you just give your embryos to some third party coordinator at a clinic, and then they decide who your family and your children are going to be connected to for the rest of your life? And
Well,
right?
it's
Like, that's
exactly
bananas, right?
that's what I can't fathom. Like my best friend offered me her ex, right? If you've listened to the podcast, you know that. And I said, that was an amazing thing, but I know me well enough, and I was just like, I need to have my family on my own. And then when she asked if I could be a sperm donor, I was like, again, I couldn't even do that, because I would sit there going, hang on a sec, this child that you now have is half mine, and I don't know if I could relinquish that emotional or the mental connection. But I now have embryos that are related to my children, directly related. I'm like one of the last podcasts we did was, are they twins or are they not? Because they were made at the same time. I think they're not, because they have to be carried at the same time. But Julio's like, well, they're twins. And then I'm having a twin that I'm like, here, take my child, and
Right.
now your child. Like, I
It it
that
stretches.
blows my mind. That blows my mind.
Exactly. It really stretches conceptualization. But I think, to your point of, is it impersonal? It's extremely impersonal. So is that easier for some people? Sometimes. But our real philosophy is, what's easier sometimes on the front end does not set you up for long-term family functioning, and isn't best for the kids involved on the back end. So, not knowing who your embryos, where they go, and not having that ability to connect, we have a different model for that. But
Oh, I see what you're saying. So you're basically saying that with that, let's call it impersonal, with the fertility model where the clinic is involved, you you might not necessarily have the connection child genetic parents, but with yours, you're saying that maybe you do
it's
have that.
connected. Yeah. And so, when I was researching and looking into these clinic programs, I had the same experience you did, where I was like, oh my God, why did I didn't even think of this. Like, of course the embryo donors would want to know if somebody was successful with their genetic embryo, and these are full genetic siblings raised in different homes with different parents. And the model of these de-identified baby seeds that the clinics kind of do, because it is easier. Relationships are complicated, as you probably well know. And, and that's our area of expertise, how to navigate these unique relationships. But, I started looking at these clinics, and then I met my two partners. So one of my partners is Gina Davis, and she's a genetic counselor. And she has two children through IVF, and then had 16 embryos remaining, and then opted to donate them in different ways, because that's a lot of embryos, right? But her thought, there were many thoughts. She was working in the field of reproductive medicine and seeing people who really were in need of embryos, and she won the lottery essentially with her cycle. But the idea that she could just give 16 embryos to the clinic to just figure out what to do with was just off the table for her. She really dug into the donor conceived person's perspective and ended up donating within her family to her uncle and a second wife. And they have a little girl who's the full genetic sibling to her two children. They call her a sister cousin because that's exactly what she is. She's both a
Right.
sister and a
But
cousin. Yeah, exactly.
I'm like, so I think that's what I can't personally get my head around, that somebody else will be raising my child.
Right. Because you're conceptualizing this as your child.
Yeah.
Right. So she doesn't conceptualize this little girl as her child. She conceptualizes it as she had, I mean, I shouldn't speak for her, but I know her well enough that she had all these embryos and she wants to do what's right for her family and her children. And she wants to be available to any child who is curious about their genetic contributors. And this little girl is raised by different parents. They all know each other. The kids all really care about each other, but they're not raised as siblings. And she doesn't see this child as her child. She sees it as her recipient's child, her, right?
Right.
She doesn't, it's not hers.
Exactly. But I guess that because they have that, the connection, they know it, right? But can you imagine that, and this is the bit, I guess, where I'm saying is, if I just gave them to some coordinator who then gave them someone else, I'm like, literally somebody else in the world is raising my, and again, it comes back to my
Right.
conceptualization, which I totally get. But I'm like, somebody else somewhere is raising my child. What if they're doing a really bad job? I mean, what if
Right.
they're doing a better job and that child ends up being I'm like, I'm not saying I'm a perfect parent, but I'm like, I really struggle with that. And then that's why I didn't do the sperm donation in the first place, let alone now the embryo donation. So I guess I love that the personal connection that you're creating. Um, so
Yeah.
how do you do that matching?
Yeah. So I can explain my platform. Let me mention my other partner too, though, because she has a totally different experience. And it's on the flip side. She had twins through IVF. Her name is Jen Vesbit, and she had twins through IVF and then one embryo remaining. So there's such, when we're talking about conceptualization and making meaning of sharing genetics in this really unique way, Gina knew she couldn't have 16 children, right? Jen had one more embryo. And so that's a totally different experience. You have two, right? And so two embryos remaining. So when you're talking about like who donates, why do people donate? How do
Yeah,
people get to this, place, and so she struggled. She met the sort of the research on embryo donors exactly. 5 years, she gets the storage bill every year and she's like, just pay it. Just pay it. Right. And then you get to the point where 5 years have passed and you go, do I really want to spend the money continuing to store this? What's the end result here? You're
yeah.
going to hold on to your embryos, but then what? Does it go into a trust for your children when they're adults? I've seen it. Right?
Yeah, I like that. This was one of the conversations that Julio and I had, where I'll probably get emotional and start crying again because that's just typically what I do.
It's
But it's
emotional.
like, I have these embryos, and if I die, they're in my will. They go to Julio in case he wants to have a family. But then at the same time, I also think, with stem cell therapy and all these different things, like we did cord blood banking, right? For the
Mhm.
stem cells from the cord blood, they are stored for my kids. But I'm like, you hear stories of then you need to have a genetic sibling in case there's something that happens and you have to have a child that, like, to me, it's just, again, it's that conceptualization of these could be children. I don't want any more children. I'm like at that happy point now where my kids are amazing and I can't even conceptualize having nappies or diapers and sleepless nights and all those things. I mean, like, just not for me. But I'm like, and yet I still can't do anything with the embryos.
Right. So that paralysis, that disposition dilemma is super common. And I think it's also getting harder as technology advances with PGT testing. Like PGT testing wasn't as popular a decade ago, so now everybody does PGT testing. So, the percentage chance, a lot of clinics will say, oh, these have a 60 to 70% chance of becoming people, essentially. You know the sex often, so the conceptualization of these are little girls, or I have two boys and two, whatever kind of conceptualization. And then you meet your own children and they're amazing. And you think, gosh, how do I just destroy these, or how do I, right? And so then you become paralyzed. If you can afford it, you keep paying your storage bill and you look the other way. But that's not a resolution. And for a lot of people, the having remaining embryos still connects them to their clinic and to their fertility journey. So we, when you say, how do we match? We start with education so that we can, because we know that embryo donation is not for everyone. And the early organizations that dealt with embryo donation called it adoption, a lot of them, and had a little bit of a pro-life, I shouldn't say a little bit, a lot of a pro-life religious rhetoric around them, save the unborn babies and stuff. We're not like that. We know that embryo donation is not for everyone. You probably not a great candidate to be an embryo donor, right? Because your most important thing in your life is the health of your family and your children, your own mental health and well-being. And donating to somebody else might cause you a lot of distress, So we help educate people. We're not trying to increase the number of people who are donating necessarily. We're trying to provide options and education that's not biased, that respects all people's decision, and that focuses on the children involved. Right. And so we learned about, so the three of us came together in 2019. We started really doing education and support because there's not a lot of people talking about embryo donation. The clinics don't want to deal with it because it's not very lucrative for them, and it's kind of a pain. And so
it's still a topic that isn't really spoken about, which is why we're having this. Because I had a friend of mine last week reach out and say, hey, I've got these embryos, what do I do with them? And I'm like, I don't know. To the clinic, right? That would be my natural reaction. But it's like the whole point of this podcast is that educational angle of what are your options. It's that landscape, and I think one of the things sorry, I totally cut you off, and I'm sorry for interrupting. I have a tendency to do that. What is the difference between an embryo adoption and embryo donation? Because you touched on it quickly, but I'm still not entirely sure.
So, and that could be a whole 2-hour podcast in and of itself. But in a nutshell, embryo donation, so ASRM really validates embryo donation as this process where remaining embryos are essentially donated to that somebody makes for them their own use originally, is then they're donated to somebody else for their family building. The adoption narrative came into play early on in embryo donation because there are some places. So there's the clinic model of these de-identified baby seeds that kind of go out, right? And then there's other organizations that were religious and kind of pro-life that were really trying to give the embryos a chance and then be adopted. So they started conceptualizing embryos as people, which we know is extremely problematic in our political landscape. And, they sometimes will do a home study and really treat it as an adoption, which ASRM has made different statements in their, ethical guidelines and various things, that it's an undue burden, I think is the language. And it creates problems with personhood. The language is important. You cannot adopt. Embryos are considered property, and of course they have really special status, and that's part of the definition as well. They have a lot of potential, but they are not people, and they're not children yet. So by calling anything an adoption, you're creating another conceptualization, and legally problematic in different ways, as we're seeing, especially in I know you're in a different country, but in the US, it's problematic to call it that. However, there's not a framework for full genetic siblings being raised in different homes with different families. So we understand people's draw to think of this as an adoption. So I'm a parent through embryo donation. I did not adopt my child. It has very different legal implications, psychological implications. There's no birth parent to my child, right? There are embryo donors, but there's not birth parents. It's a totally different psychosocial and legal experience to adopt versus to be the recipient of donated embryos.
And I guess donated embryos in the title, they're gifted. You don't buy
You
them.
Yes, exactly. It's the real only form of altruistic gamete donation. It's different, obviously, than eggs and sperm. So yes, so they're not. You don't pay an embryo donor. You pay for all the ancillary things, that go around donation. But the embryo donors don't make money, essentially.
Okay.
Um, the other thing in terms of education, just clearing some things up with the landscape that I'm seeing more and more that is, I think, is very problematic is embryo creation being called embryo donation. So there are more and more clinics and places popping up in the US that will take a young egg donor and a sperm donor, create embryos, and then call them donor embryos or donated embryos. But there's no actual donor. Does that make sense? It's there's no person. The clinic is creating these from egg and sperm donors, and then it's
Just
embryo.
the potential use with somebody in the future. They are making those embryos to put into an embryo bank to then.
Yeah. So it's embryo creation. So the landscape of embryo donation is really fraught in different ways. Our intention is to support and educate people who have gone through a fertility journey in some way, shape, or form and have embryos remaining from their cycle after their family is complete or after they've, made decisions for themselves around these embryos. But the creation of these embryos were for their use. So we start our process. So Empower with Moxie is our company, and we have a matching platform called Moxie Matching. It's Moxi, no E, but you do need a little Moxie, right? That's our to go this path. And we really start by educating people and supporting people around the questions that you're talking about. How do I make sense of this? I have 16 embryos. How many recipients should I have? Sometimes these embryos are divided among recipients, but we feel it's important for everybody to know each other. These children are full genetic siblings. We need to make sure these people are connected in some way. You don't have to go to Disneyland every year together, but you also need a consensual way to connect down the line. And we help people decide on the front end, does this feel right to me? I see your questions are forming in your
Hey, I mean,
eyeballs.
yeah, like I've got so many questions. I have so many questions. It's not even funny. So, I mean, you've basically said you don't think I would be a good person to donate embryos.
I don't mean
So
to cut you out. I don't mean to cut you
I'm
out.
totally fine with that. I don't think they're going anywhere. But how, I mean, like, can anyone donate and receive embryos?
I mean, yes. And we launched our matching platform, Moxie Matching, a year ago in August, actually. And we've made a lot of matches and we've helped people. So the way our platform works is embryo donors will make a profile, and embryo recipients also make a profile. And then we don't match people. We allow people to connect and see what feels right for them. And we ask questions about what is your ideal match? What's the ideal communication or relationship that you can envision? I mean, you don't know exactly, but you have an idea, right? The best situation is when people are like, I really want what's best for the children and I want to have connection. I'm flexible, and just really wanting to learn and grow and evolve organically. I think that's what we see as the best kind of scenario.
The
And
Holy
then
Grail of we're just open to making this work for the
yeah,
children.
right. And also, there's an intention. Sometimes this gives them meaning. Sometimes people go through a lot to get these embryos and get their children, spend a lot of money, and other people can't afford that.
Mm.
And historically, embryo donation or embryo adoption with some of these, like I was saying, pro-life religious groups, they were not inclusive organizations to single people. And this is a great option for single women who can't work with their own eggs, right? Because then they'd have to have an egg donor and a sperm donor, and it's much more expensive. And embryo donation can be a much more affordable, but also connected experience. But also LGBTQ families were really cut out of that process early on. And so we're very inclusive and have provided a pathway for people to understand what this means, make meaning of sharing genetics, explore different relationship options. And we do education, we do webinars, we have a full education platform that's free that people just can go like, what does this mean? Where do I fit? Does this make sense to me?
Mm.
What language am I going to use with my child? How do I describe this, right? All of these things that are super important to consider. And then they decide, oh, this donor feels like a good fit for me. And they request to meet the donor. And then we facilitate it from there on out. We do, my partner Jen is amazing. She's a nationally certified counselor, an embryo donor. She gets it. And she facilitates these early match meetings. So we do a Zoom where the donor and recipients meet each other and you're like, hi, like, what do you think about this?
Tell
What do
me
you
more. Why are you doing this? Yeah.
Right. And also, how do you want to raise your kids? Do you believe in whatever, right? Everybody's got different things. We ask about politics on our profile.
Oh,
And we also,
crikey.
I think, yeah, but that's important for people, especially right now, especially in the US. We ask about what are your deal breakers? What feels right to you? What doesn't feel right to you, right? There's so many different considerations for this. And we want people to talk about it on the front end before getting into bed with people, right? It's like you want to have a little bit more of an orientation, and Jen facilitates that. And then they decide if it feels like a good fit to pursue. And then.
So just on that very quickly, I'm like, do you find that the people with the power in that dynamic are the ones that have the embryos? Because they're the ones that are going to gift them over, not the people that are wanting it. So do you ever have that feeling of, well, they're just saying whatever they need to say in order to get this match to be able to take the embryos? Or is it deeper than that and you really delve into different aspects to figure out?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I could see a situation where that potentially could happen.
Yeah. And I think that maybe is what makes our company unique. We're all counselors. I'm a therapist, Jen's a counselor, Gina's a genetic counselor. We can smell it if somebody's just trying to, and it comes across in their profile too. And we really value, we call it our Moxie family because we become a part of your family. Like if you were going to donate with us, like we're up in your business. So you have to do it.
Yeah.
And people really appreciate it, especially when it comes to understanding genetics and the landscape of medical and genetic history. We have a different approach to this where we gather genetic and medical information from the embryo donors that it looks really different than a 22-year-old egg donor. Because embryo donors have lived longer and they want to give as much health history as possible to any potential child. So they share. And so before you match, you will know if there's a family history of X, Y, and Z, and you can understand if that feels comfortable for you. The first stop. So once people match, then we move them through our Moxie journey management, which is like the logistics. And that's where we have to get into the weeds with the clinics and are we shipping embryos? Does this clinic accept outside embryo? All the stuff that I've been going gray in the last year. like it's the clinics that are creating that. But also because they just don't have the staff. They don't have the infrastructure to manage these open directed relationships sometimes. So but we do all of it. We take it off the clinic's plate. We figure out the logistics. We can do, FDA testing, et cetera, et cetera. And then the match moves through genetic counseling first, then mental health, and then legal. So we do all these ancillary professionals because we believe it sets people up very well for their future families. And each round of conversation, you are getting more involved and deeper into what do we want to tell our children? Okay, what do you do if there are embryos remaining after the recipients are successful, right? There's so many different pieces.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I'd like to now go. A little bit of so you've 16 embryos have been donated to your cousin. They get pregnant first go. Then your cousin has 14 of your embryos. Are they allowed to then donate them on? Do they have to give them back? I mean,
Right.
how does that work? And then something that I'm a big proponent of is, looking after the best interests of the children. So how do you then make sure that relationship, not only with the recipient and the donor, but the children and their genetic siblings?
Right.
Like, how's that?
Yeah. And so that's exactly what we do and exactly why it's a little bit messy. But legally, what generally happens is that once you donate, if you're a donor and you donate to a recipient, it's kind of, I mean, there are nuances, of course, but in a nutshell, there's something called reversion, where once the recipient has completed their family, if there are embryos remaining, the ownership, custody of those embryos can go back to the original donors. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is, and this is what we see often also, like as we're working on this, we see attorneys sometimes, the recipient, then they make a joint decision essentially on the remaining embryos, because sometimes also embryo quality plays a role. Like there are other factors in what makes the most sense. But if there are good quality remaining embryos after the first recipient is family is completed, that first recipient can then essentially be in charge of finding. Sorry, is that, are you
That,
okay?
sorry, sausages. Sorry.
So there are two choices really with remaining embryos after a first donation, and we call it a sequential donation. And so either those embryos can revert back, like ownership, custody can revert back to the original donors, or the first recipients can then be in charge in a way of helping to find the next set of recipients with the donor being involved. So we have a case like that right now. My partner Gina is in this right now because she just found another set of recipients for those embryos remaining after her uncle was
Right.
completed.
Yeah. This. Yeah.
So just some legal addendums and things like that. But basically, everybody's going to connect. And so when we do the facilitated match meeting, for these we have a recipient that has now become a donor. But when we do the match meeting, we brought back the original embryo donors so that they can participate also.
That just
It's
seems
a
like an
lot.
awful lot of logistics and trying to figure out. I mean, like if you're dealing with anybody like me who has a tendency to overthink everything anyway,
Yeah.
oof, that just seems like a lot.
Yes, but we do the hard stuff. You just would show up, right? So as the donor, we would say to you, here's the profile that your recipient has created to now find out, do you want to add to it? What do you think, right? All of the genetic contributors are important factors. And we would do this also if there's an egg donor involved and they were open. Now, a lot of people weren't open or aren't open. We're seeing a shift in that. But we invite people back to the table for genetic counseling because honestly, genetic health history changes over time, right? So we feel it's really important and that the children will really benefit from having additional information about their genetic health history. So even though this part can feel really messy, we think that it is better for everybody involved, and we do the messy part. People just
Right.
have to show up to these meetings and be like, do y'all like each other? Do y'all have questions? Right? Like that's important.
If people could take the messy stuff off my plate in my life, it would be amazing.
I know, right?
Just show up would be fantastic.
Yeah,
Um,
and I don't know why we decided that we're the messy people, but I
like
think
you literally put your hand up and said, "No, we'll do that for you." I'm
no.
like,
And there are moments, honestly, Richard, where I'm like, what did we do? But we know it's the most ethical choice. We know this is best for children. We know it is not right. I mean, we've heard stories and we've known people. I'm a psychotherapist in this field too. I know people. I had somebody just yesterday, her egg donor cycled and has 73 eggs. Wants one child. She's going to have so many remaining embryos. What if she just gave those back to the clinic? And there are 40 embryos with the same genetic contributor that get distributed, one per family, out in the world. That's
yeah.
really problematic. And
It comes back to I know you made a Netflix movie, but there's that Netflix show about the sperm donor who's just
oh my gosh, I just saw that.
right. And I'm just like, all of a sudden, what if you've got 40 siblings around the world that you don't even know about, and you
Exactly.
do a 23andMe thing, and then all of a sudden, ping, 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 here you go, and you're just like, what?
And that's the donor conceived, the donor conceived community is really speaking up now
Yeah.
about how challenging this is for people and for their identities and for their, people are learning about siblings and half siblings along the way. With embryos, these are full genetic siblings. So it's really important that these children have access to understand each other. And on the flip side, we are really helping people expand, and I know this makes your head explode a little bit, but expand the meaning of family in a way. And again, people don't have to be family and best friends and all these things, but a lot of our matches have decided that feels good for them. And so they have met, we have people who've met, in person. We've had people who, they're just connected in different ways, and they have, and everybody's comfortable with it. They see the value in more people who care about these children. And,
Well, I mean, to get to this point, you've been through struggles. You've been through hell and back, right? Let's be honest. You don't just go, "Oh, let's go to embryo donation." No,
right,
you've tried everything that you can, or you have no money and this is the only route available to you.
right, right.
So to that point, I totally get that. And I am a big, again, I really firmly believe that all a family needs is love, right? You just need to provide that child with the safety, the security that they are loved unconditionally.
Yeah.
And I think, again, a great friend of mine, Brett, has done this. He's donated embryos and he's in touch with those families, and he's like got photographs, and I was talking to him the other day, actually. He was just like, "Look, this don't they look exactly the same?" I'm like, "Of course they do. They're full siblings."
Right. And I think about this too with my own child, my own daughter, she's an only child. When I was a very broken and vulnerable and desperate fertility patient, the idea that there could be genetic siblings and other families and genetic contributors that could be connected to my daughter probably would have scared me. I don't know exactly, right? But that feeling, the initial feeling of like, will this child feel like mine? And all those fears that recipients might have, they're legit. But as you establish yourself as a parent, a lot of it dissipates. And if we had connection to her genetic siblings that would be amazing. What
Right.
a missed opportunity. What if we had other people that did look like her and she did have a connection to, and that we could, I'm totally open to it now because I'm confident that I'm the only parent for her, and all of those things. But, it's just one of these things where you have to have an open mind and a willingness to expand the definition of family in some way, shape, or form, or just to embrace somebody else's genetics and let the children figure it out. Right? There's the spectrum of all of these
Yeah.
things.
I love the fact that we just need to expand the definition of family, right? That to me that's a real moment. I love that.
And we're seeing it, and it's like we have donors who like are single women, and now there's like a cohort of 3 single women who will all hopefully, knock on wood that everybody's successful, but that will all have genetic siblings, and they're all going to connect and have a relationship. They don't have to all vacation together, but these children will grow up knowing there are other children who were at the same cohort. Now, are they twins? Are they triplets? Are they, all these things? They were created at the same moment in time with the same genetic contributors. And while genetics aren't obviously the only thing that make a family, it's, there is importance and value, and everybody takes it differently and things like that. But yeah, we're really trying to help people make meaning of this and decide if this is right for them, and give the clinics like an option for something different.
Yeah. But I love the fact that you've basically said a couple of things. We're giving people optionality. If this is right for you, great. If it isn't, that's also fine.
Yeah.
And again, that expanding the feeling of family and what does it mean, and that I always say your heart grows every time you have a child, and you never think it can, and then all of a sudden it grows another even more,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that is so beautiful, and I just wow. We could keep talking, and I'm
No.
sure we will, right? But thank you so much. I think that was really, really. I'm still not going to donate my embryos just
That,
yet. Just
you
yet. Growth mindset. Growth mindset. Maybe.
You never know. And you know what? When your kids are teenagers or later teenagers, sometimes we see people make a joint decision where the kids come in and they say, you know what? Let's find somebody that, is in need and we could connect to, and there's permission there or something. You never know, but it's important to know yourself
Yeah.
and not be pushed to do something that's not right for you. Because if it's not right for you, it's not going to be right for the kids that are
Exactly.
connected.
But I do believe, like with everything that we talk about, like being fully informed, being fully empowered to make your decisions, And also, I guess I had never even thought about asking them, my children, what do they think? That's insane.
Yeah. And not
But
that you have to, but again, it's like, I think it's such a nuanced space that people need some guidance and support to make the best decisions for themselves and their families and future families,
yeah,
not to be persuaded to do something based on religion or or whatever, or some other rhetoric. It's really about like, ultimately what's best for all the children involved. What are my options? How do I feel about these options? What are my fears? We embrace all of that stuff because they're real. Like, what are you going to do? So but yeah, you can send your friends our way who have
I
remaining embryos.
will. And I will also send them to watch your movie. I think it's fantastic. So
Thank
Maya, thank you so much. Really, this has been fantastic. You're amazing. I love what you're doing. And if anybody wants to learn any more, let me know and I will put you directly in touch.
thank you.
Thank you so much. And there we go. So sausages, thank you. That was awesome.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. It's like we can go in so many different directions with
I
all this.
know, right? But that's the wonderful thing. That's the wonderful thing. If we then get questions and people DM us and stuff, like I always try to leave it open to bringing people back in to have another conversation and stuff. So,
Yeah. And if you
um,
ever want to make partners, like they're great and they have a different perspective as donors too. So if you wanted to do embryo donation part 2 and 3 or something, I can
yeah,
definitely connect that.
cool.
But I love what you guys are doing. It's really beautiful and
Thank you. I
it,
mean, it's hard work, right? It's
it's a lot.
challenging. It's always like, and then we always have these conversations, him and I, like Julio and I, about what are we doing? How are we doing this? How are we doing that? Is it controversial enough? Are we playing it too safe? Are we like, it's just, are we actually tackling topics people are interested in? I mean, it's a lot. So,
Yeah.
but he's amazing and he
Yeah.
just like is so supportive because this is his way of being there to learn about family and he's amazing. So.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well,
Cool.
thank you
Well,
so
thank you
much.
so much.
Let me know
And
if you need anything else, and when it comes out, just let me know, and then we can push it on our social
yeah,
channels.
I will do it. Probably, I might even. It's going to be soon. It'll be very soon.
No pressure. I know it's still summer.
Yeah.
Okay, take
Take
care. Are
care.
you going to be at ASRM this year in
I'm
Denver? Or?
not. I don't really go to ASRM.
Okay.
I just it's not because I'm not medical. It doesn't. I mean, they want me to go. They want me to be like the face of IV. They want me to do. I'm like, let's wait and see.
What do you do with IV again? Remind me.
So I look after all of the international, we call them outreach coordinators. So
Uh,
anybody who's helping all of our patients to navigate what is IVF surrogacy, kind of having like bit like you with the embryo
yeah.
donation program. We do that with anybody who's looking at IVF or surrogacy. We're there to just be the sounding board so they understand what their options are, provide them with the landscape. I've got about 20 people, well, 19 people working for me now, which
Wow.
is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But it's
Great.
amazing.
Yeah. I mean, also you're giving a lot of people access that don't have access in different countries. I mean, that's you know.
Yeah. Hence why we're in Europe and we're in Asia and we're Australia.
Yeah.
Anywhere basically that's difficult to go through surrogacy,
Yeah.
that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
But we're probably on target, I think, to do about 600 surrogacy cycles a year.
Amazing.
It's amazing, which is
Yeah.
just, again, that blows my mind that to your point, like 10 years ago, this was nothing and nobody knew about it. And now by education and by platforms and what we're doing, people can understand and they can learn and they can make those decisions that are right for them,
Yeah.
not the decisions that are right for the clinic or the agency. No, it's like, this is my family. What
Exactly.
do I want? How am I going to do this? And you can't do that unless you have the information.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
do a lot of education.
Yeah. Well, amazing work, and I won't see you at ASRM, but yeah,
But
it's
I'm sure
lovely to meet you.
our paths will cross.
Yes. Take care.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye.